August 29, 1945. A clearing on Luzon. The air, thick with the smell of wet earth and diesel, hung heavy in Hisako's lungs. She watched a beetle, iridescent and oblivious, trundle over the cracked leather of her shoe. A noise, not the familiar crack of rifles or the distant whump of mortars. It was a rhythmic, metallic clatter. Foreign, men's voices, speaking a language that sounded like rocks tumbling in a can, grew louder. Hisako's hands, which had just finished dressing a burn on another woman's arm, tightened in her lap. The other nurses sat frozen, a stillness of prey. The propaganda films had been very clear about what happened next. The tall, pale men, the American devils, would appear from the jungle, and their victory would be written on the bodies of the women they found. One of the younger girls, Ota, began a low, keening whimper. Hisako didn't tell her to be quiet. There was no point. The sounds were closer now. A shadow fell over their small group. She looked up not at the face but at the gun. A long, dark rifle held loosely in one hand. The man it was attached to was enormous, his skin burned red by the sun. He gestured with the weapon, not aiming it but pointing, a short, sharp motion, a command. She didn't understand the word he grunted, but the meaning was clear. Get up. Move. Hisako felt a cold line of certainty trace its way down her spine. The march would be the beginning. Forest would be the end. She braced herself for the shove, the blow from a rifle butt, the casual cruelty that signaled the start of the real war, the one fought after the surrender. She got to her feet, her gaze fixed on a point in the middle distance, a place in her mind where she could retreat. But the shove never came. The man just waited, his boots planted in the mud, the rifle dangling from his hand like a piece of farm equipment. He smelled of sweat and something bitter, like stale coffee. He simply stood there, a silent, waiting obstacle, as 27 Japanese women rose from the dirt and began to walk toward a future they thought they already knew. They were the survivors of the 42nd Field Hospital Unit, nurses, aides, and civilian staff attached to a rearguard detachment of the Imperial Army that had effectively ceased to exist 3 days prior. Before the final radio message crackled into silence, they had been women of purpose. Their world was one of sterile gauze, antiseptic scarcity, and the precise, disciplined work of patching together men shredded by shrapnel and bullets. Hana, the head nurse, still thought in terms of inventory. 17 rolls of clean bandages left, 12 vials of morphine, 81 men who would need them, then 70, then 45. Now the number was 0. Her purpose had evaporated, replaced by a single, overriding imperative, managing the survival of the 26 other women who looked to her for cues. Their old context was a rigid hierarchy where their value was functional. They served the emperor by serving his soldiers. Their bodies were instruments of care, their minds archives of medical procedure. The new context was formless, a terrifying void. They were no longer army nurses, they were prisoners. They were a resource to be claimed by the victor. The material stakes had shifted from medical supplies to their own physical integrity. Food, water, shelter, these were abstract concerns compared to the immediate, visceral threat the proximity of the enemy soldiers represented. As they were marched from the ruined hospital clearing toward a makeshift camp, Yuki, a young nurse from Kagoshima, found her eyes tracing the perimeter of their new reality. The guards walked with a strange looseness, their rifles held casually, not pressed against their shoulders in readiness. They didn't shout. They didn't bind their hands. When one of the older women stumbled, a guard stopped and waited for her to regain her footing, his face impassive. This small, neutral act was a profound anomaly. It didn't fit the established narrative. It was a piece of data that had no place in the equation of their expected fate. The world they had been trained to understand was one of absolutes, honor and shame, victory and death, Japanese spirit and barbarian cruelty. This quiet, procedural march was something else entirely. It was confusing. And for women trained to see patterns, the lack of a familiar one was the most frightening thing of all. The risk was no longer a shell landing on the hospital tent. It was the unknown variable of their captors' intent, a threat that lived behind their unreadable eyes. The contrast began with the water. In the final weeks before their capture, water was a treasure, hauled from a murky stream and boiled, doled out in half-cup increments. It tasted of smoke and earth. Here a soldier pointed to a canvas bag suspended from a tripod, a metal spigot at its base. A Lister bag. Hana watched as one of the women, Fumiko, hesitantly held her canteen beneath it. The water that came out was clear. It tasted faintly of chemicals, a clean, sterile taste that spoke of industrial process, of a system. The women drank, their eyes wide with a kind of cautious wonder. That was the first comparison. The second was the food. Their last meals had been a thin gruel of rice, sometimes with a few foraged leaves. They were perpetually hungry, a low-grade ache that had become their constant companion. That evening, a soldier dropped 2 wooden crates on the ground. He pried one open with a bayonet. Inside were small green boxes and tins, K-rations. He demonstrated how to open one, his movements economical, like a man teaching a simple, repetitive task. He didn't throw the food at them. He didn't make them beg. He opened the crate and walked away. The women stared at the bounty. Tins of processed meat, crackers sealed in cellophane, hard squares of chocolate. A single ration box contained more calories than they had consumed in the past 3 days. Yuki held the small chocolate bar in her palm, feeling its weight. It was an object of impossible luxury, an absurdity. The third contrast was space. In the field hospital, privacy was non-existent. They slept in cramped rows, their personal space constantly violated by the urgent needs of the wounded. The soldiers of their own army moved among them with an air of ownership, their presence a constant low-level pressure. Here the guards established a perimeter and stayed outside it. They did not enter the large tent they had been assigned. They did not stare. They maintained a deliberate, almost clinical distance. At night, the women huddled together, expecting the tent flap to be thrown open. But it never was. The sounds from the American camp were of men talking, sometimes laughing, the clink of metal, the hum of a generator. The sounds of a world that was, for now, choosing to leave them alone. Scarcity versus abundance. Proximity versus distance. Whim versus procedure. These were the new binaries that were beginning to define their existence, and each comparison chipped away at the terrible certainty they had carried with them out of the jungle. Hana Tanaka, at 41, was a woman who found comfort in order. She had run a surgical ward in Tokyo before the war, a place of clean lines, sharp instruments, and predictable outcomes. War had replaced that with chaos, but she had fought it with checklists and schedules, imposing a fragile logic upon the madness. Now a prisoner, her mind continued the habit. She counted everything. 27 women. Approximately 1,200 calories per ration pack. 3 packs per person per day. A 5-day supply in the crates she could see. She watched the guards change. A rotation of 12 men in 4-hour shifts. Their movements were standardized. Their interactions with the prisoners were minimal and routed through one man, an officer who spoke a few words of broken Japanese. Hana noticed he never made direct eye contact with her for more than a second. It wasn't shyness, it felt like a rule. Emi Suzuki, who was only 19 and had been a laundry aide, saw things differently. Her world wasn't a spreadsheet, it was a map of sensations. She catalogued the smells, the sharp, unfamiliar scent of the American cigarettes, the fatty smell of their cooking, so different from the wood smoke and fish broth of home. She listened to the cadence of their speech, the way their voices rose and fell without the sharp, guttural commands of the Japanese officers. She noted the fabric of their uniforms. It was thick, sturdy cotton, a uniform green, unlike the patched and faded khaki of their own defeated army. These details were her data points. They told a story of a nation that could afford to waste calories on chocolate and issue every soldier a uniform that wasn't falling apart. Then there was Yuki Sato. She was the one who processed the emotional dissonance. She kept a small, forbidden diary, writing in a clipped, coded script. One entry read, "They look at us, but not through *us. The Japanese officers look through us as if we were tools. These men look at us as if we are objects, problems to be managed. It is insulting, but it is also a relief." Yuki was the one who observed the small acts of non-aggression. She saw a young guard stoop to pick up a doll one of the civilian children had dropped, placing it back on a crate without a word. She saw another shoo away a group of local men who had gathered at the edge of the camp, their curiosity turning predatory. He didn't do it with violence, but with a flat, authoritative gesture. These weren't acts of kindness. Yuki felt that distinction keenly. They were acts of impersonal administration, and in that impersonality there was a strange and unexpected form of safety. The women couldn't see the system, but they were beginning to feel its invisible architecture. The repeatable, predictable behavior of the soldiers wasn't a coincidence of temperament, it was the product of a machine. That machine was built from regulations, logistics, and a specific military doctrine regarding the handling of prisoners of war. The American officer with the broken Japanese was following a field manual. His clipped, impersonal briefings were scripts. The rules he conveyed: line up for food at 800 and 1700 hours, report any sickness to the guards, do not leave the designated area, were direct translations from a pocket-sized booklet. This was a system designed for scale, to process thousands of prisoners from different cultures with maximum efficiency and minimum incident. It was a bureaucracy applied to the chaos of a battlefield. Hannah began to grasp this when she saw the paperwork. An American medic, a man with tired eyes and gentle hands, came to assess their health. He worked with an assistant who carried a clipboard. For each woman he made a notation: name, age, apparent condition. He didn't ask about their military service. He didn't ask for intelligence. He was a functionary in a public health apparatus. He was collecting data. The women were being inventoried just like the medical supplies. This realization was both dehumanizing and profoundly reassuring. Be a number on a list was to be an object of administrative concern. It meant there was a plan. The logistics that underpinned this were staggering. The clean water in the Lister bag was purified with chlorine tablets mass-produced in a factory 10,000 miles away. The K-rations were assembled on a production line, their contents scientifically calibrated for nutrition. The tents, the blankets, the medical supplies, all of it flowed through a supply chain of unimaginable length and complexity. It was a system that treated its own soldiers and its prisoners as components to be managed, fueled, and maintained. The schematic metaphor that started to form in Hannah's mind was that of a vast, intricate waterworks. They were caught in one of its pipes. The flow was controlled by valves and gates far upstream. The individual guards were just taps, dispensing what the system dictated. Their personal feelings of hatred or pity were irrelevant. The system was designed to override individual impulse, to make behavior uniform and predictable. They were not being protected by good men. They were being protected by good paperwork. The second contrast unfolded in a new domain: medicine. A few days after their capture, several of the women came down with a virulent fever, likely dengue. In their own field hospital, treatment would have been aspirins if they had any, and a cool cloth on the forehead. The Japanese military's triage system was brutal and clear. A soldier capable of returning to the fight received priority. A nurse, a non-combatant, was an afterthought. The resources were for the warfighters. Hannah prepared herself for the same cold calculus. She reported the sickness to the officer, expecting a shrug, perhaps a few quinine tablets if she was lucky. Instead, 2 American medics arrived within the hour. They didn't just bring quinine. They brought sulfur drugs, a powder so miraculous in its effects that Hannah had only read about it in a captured medical journal. They brought intravenous drips for rehydration. They set up a quarantine corner in the tent, following a protocol for infectious disease that was textbook perfect. One of the medics, a quiet, methodical man, deferred to Hannah's judgment as a nurse. He showed her the dosage on the sulfur packets and watched her administer the first dose, a gesture of professional respect that felt more shocking than any act of overt kindness. Here was the contrast in stark relief. Under the Japanese system, their value was instrumental and contingent on their service to the fighting man. Their health was secondary. Under this new American system, their health was a logistical problem to be solved. The system's goal was to prevent an outbreak in a POW camp, a goal that required treating them as patients first, prisoners second. One anchor data point seared itself into Hannah's memory: the amount of distilled water used for the IV drips. Over 3 days, they used more than 50 liters. 50 liters of sterile, medically pure water for sick Japanese women in the middle of a war zone. Her unit had been lucky to get 5 liters a week for cleaning surgical wounds. This wasn't mercy, it was infrastructure. It was a system that had so much surplus, so much logistical depth, that it could afford to spend its resources on the health of its enemies. The realization was dizzying. They were not being cared for, they were being managed by an apparatus of overwhelming material superiority. The friction was ideological. Every woman in the camp had been raised on the doctrine of Yamato Damashe, the unique, indomitable Japanese spirit. They had been taught that their spiritual purity and willingness to endure hardship would triumph over the enemy's material strength. The Americans were soft, decadent, and individualistic. They were devils, rapists, and murderers. This was not just propaganda, it was the bedrock of their worldview, the thing that gave meaning to their suffering. Now that worldview was cracking under the weight of lived experience. The devils were providing clean water, sulfur drugs, and chocolate. The soft, decadent individualists were operating with a discipline that was rigid and unnervingly impersonal. The dissonance created a quiet, intense crisis in the tent each night. "Perhaps it is a trick," Emmy whispered one evening. "They are fattening us up for something worse." The thought was a comfort in a way. It allowed the world to still make sense. Cruelty in disguise was more comprehensible than procedural neutrality, but as days turned into a week, the trick never materialized. The something worse never came. The role inversions were constant and jarring. In the Japanese military structure, the women were subordinate to the lowest-ranking male soldier. Their expertise as nurses was respected only within the narrow confines of the hospital tent. Outside it, they were simply women, subject to the orders and whims of any man in a uniform. Here, a strange equality began to emerge. When the American medics consulted Hana, they treated her as a professional peer. They listened to her assessments of the patients. Her competence was seen and acknowledged. This was a more profound shock than the food or the medicine. To be seen as competent, not as a woman, not as a Japanese, but as a nurse, was to have a piece of her identity restored that she hadn't even realized was lost. What does it mean when your enemy affirms your professional dignity more than your own countrymen did? The question hung in the humid air of the tent. The core assumption being violated was that the victor's behavior is governed by power and appetite. The evidence suggested it was being governed by a rulebook. Their captors, the men with the guns and the absolute power over their lives, seemed to be constrained by something invisible, something they carried in their heads. The evidence accumulated in small, verifiable clusters. It wasn't in grand pronouncements, but in the mundane details of their confinement, details that Hana and the other women observed, memorized, and discussed in low voices. First, the rations. The K-rations were not just random boxes of food, they were a complete self-contained system. Each box contained 3 separate meals, breakfast, dinner, and supper. Each meal was clearly labeled. Each component, the crackers, the cheese, the coffee powder, the sugar cube, was individually wrapped and sealed. Hana, holding one of the boxes, realized it was a perfect artifact of the system that created it. It was standardized, portion-controlled, and designed for mass distribution. There was no ambiguity. This was your food for this meal. The quantity was fixed. The fact that they, the prisoners, received the exact same boxes as the American soldiers was a detail Yuki noted in her diary. There wasn't a separate, inferior prisoner food. There was just the logistical unit. 1 box, 1 person, 1 day. Second, the sanitation. On the 3rd day, the American officer, through his interpreter, issued a new set of instructions regarding waste disposal. A specific area was designated as a latrine. He provided them with shovels and rolls of toilet paper. He explained the need to bury the waste to prevent disease. This wasn't a suggestion, it was an order, delivered with the same impersonal gravity as the instructions about food distribution. It was a public health directive. The women recalled the filth of their own army's camps, where dysentery was a constant, accepted threat. Here, hygiene was a matter of military procedure. The toilet paper, soft and white, felt like an emblem of this incomprehensible reality. Third, the Geneva Conventions. A week into their captivity, a new officer arrived, an older man with glasses and a sheaf of papers. He had a proper interpreter. He assembled the women and read a statement. Hana recognized some of the phrases from her international law training at nursing school, phrases she had assumed were theoretical ideals, not practical guidelines. They were to be treated humanely. Their personal belongings would not be taken. They would be provided with adequate food, shelter, and medical care. He read the articles in a flat, bureaucratic tone. It was a legal notification. For the women, it was a revelation. The invisible rules had a name. They weren't just internal American Army regulations. They were part of an international agreement. The behavior of their captors was not a matter of choice. It was a matter of law. The evidence was irrefutable. They were inside a machine governed by text. The emotional cost of this slow-motion demolition of their world was immense. The initial terror, a sharp and clarifying feeling, had been replaced by a disorienting fog of confusion. Fear at least had a clear object, the enemy soldier. But how do you process an enemy who follows a rulebook? The breakdown happened in stages, in the quiet moments between the scheduled events of their new lives. For Emmy, it manifested as a deep, unshakable weariness. Her body, finally receiving adequate nutrition, should have been getting stronger, but she felt drained, as if the psychic effort of rearranging her understanding of the world was more exhausting than malnutrition had ever been. She would sit for hours, staring at the neatly stacked ration boxes, her mind a blank. The familiar narratives of duty, sacrifice, and enemy brutality had been hollowed out, and nothing had yet taken their place. For Yuki, the process was more volatile. She felt flashes of anger, a strange and unsettling resentment. She was angry at the Americans for their calm, infuriating efficiency. She was angry at her own commanders for the lies they had told, and she was angry at herself for the relief she felt, a feeling that seemed like a betrayal of her country, her comrades, the dead. One night, she tore a page from her diary, crumpled it into a tight ball, and held it in her fist until her knuckles were white. The words on it had felt like a treason. The relief is so great it feels like a sickness. The crescendo came not with a scream, but with a whisper. It was late, the camp was silent except for the chirping of insects. Hana lay on her cot, listening to the steady breathing of the other women. For the first time in over a year, the knot of anxiety that had lived permanently in her stomach was gone. It had uncoiled silently, without her permission. She placed a hand on her abdomen, feeling the unaccustomed softness. The absence of fear was so profound it felt like a physical presence. And then, a single hot tear traced a path from the corner of her eye into her hairline. It wasn't a tear of sadness or of joy. It was a tear of sheer, overwhelming cognitive collapse. The world was not as she had been told. That simple, devastating fact had finally landed, not in her mind, but in her body. The war had ended, but a different, more internal battle was just beginning. The revelation did not arrive in a flash of insight, but as the slow dawn of a terribly simple idea. Hana lay on her cot, the feeling of the single tear still cool on her temple, and she watched the shadow of a guard pass by the tent wall, a silent, rhythmic patrol. The men were not the point. Their individual characters, their kindness or cruelty, their thoughts about the Japanese, were all irrelevant noise. She had been trying to understand the men when she should have been trying to understand the rules that contained them. The system was the true agent of their humane treatment. It was the author of their survival. The turn, when it crystallized in her mind, was a single stark sentence. The rules governing their captors were stronger than the men themselves. This was the key. It reinterpreted everything. The impersonal distance was not contempt, it was protocol. The provision of medicine was not mercy, it was policy. The absence of violence was not a choice made by individual soldiers, it was a mandate enforced by a powerful, overarching structure of command and consequence. The immediate implication was that their safety was not fragile, it was not dependent on the shifting moods of their guards. It was robust, institutional. As long as the system held, they were secure. A second implication followed, colder and more disturbing. If a system could be built to constrain men's worst impulses, then a different system, the one they had come from, could be built to amplify them. The casual cruelty of their own officers, the disregard for the sick, the culture of absolute obedience that demanded atrocities, these were not the failings of individual bad men. They were the intended output of a different, darker machine. The world for Hana was no longer a stage for heroes and villains. It was a collection of operating systems, each with its own code, its own inputs, and its own predictable results. They had simply been moved from one to another. This new understanding allowed Hana to connect the human-scale moments to a system-scale meaning. Emi's sensory observations, the smell of plentiful coffee, the sight of sturdy, unworn boots, were not just details. They were indicators of a logistical chain so vast it could project abundance into a war zone. The system didn't just move men and bullets, it moved the entire material culture of a nation with them. Yuki's conflicted feelings of relief and betrayal were the predictable emotional consequence of ideological collapse. When the foundational stories a person uses to make sense of the world are proven false by direct experience, the result is a profound and painful disorientation. The system of American military procedure had inadvertently waged a second, psychological war on its prisoners, a war against the propaganda of their own government. The cause and effect ladder became clear. A nation committed to certain legal principles, like the Geneva Conventions, tends to build those principles into its military doctrine. That doctrine, when effectively enforced, produces standardized, predictable behavior in its soldiers, even under the extreme stress of combat. This predictable behavior, when it is unexpectedly humane, can cause a profound cognitive dissonance in prisoners who have been taught to expect brutality. This dissonance, in turn, forces a re-evaluation of their own belief systems. What had felt personal, the guard waiting for the old woman to get up, the medic deferring to Hana's expertise, was in fact the impersonal outcome of a well-designed process. The system created pockets of decency not by hoping for good men, but by making it difficult and professionally costly for its agents to be cruel. The motifs that had defined their experience now clicked into place with this new framework. The hands of the Americans, offering food or medicine, were not the hands of individuals. They were the terminus points of that immense logistical network. The quiet at night was not a gift. It was the acoustic signature of a perimeter, of a rule that said, "You will not enter that tent." The numbers she counted were the language of this new system, a language of calories, schedules, and inventory, a language of management, not of conquest. The scent of wet earth and diesel. Hana would never forget that smell on Luzon, the smell that she had believed was the prelude to her death. Now it was the smell of the beginning of her education, an education in systems. She looked at the women around her, their faces still holding a trace of caution, but no longer the stark terror of those first few hours. They were learning, too. They were learning that the character of a nation is not found in the souls of its people, but in the architecture of its rules. They were learning that what a system chooses to count, be it enemy dead or rations delivered, reveals what it truly values. Their ordeal was far from over. Repatriation, a return to a shattered homeland, the judgment of their own people, all of that lay ahead. But a fundamental question had been planted in their minds, a question that would shape the rest of their lives. What does it take to build a system that protects the vulnerable, even from its own agents? It's a question that transcends any single war or nation. If their story makes you reconsider the invisible systems that govern your own life, join the conversation below. We need to understand how these structures are built. Our next episode explores what happened when these women finally returned to Japan, and the startling reception they received from a society that had its own rigid rules for what it meant to be a survivor. Subscribe so you don't miss it.